Another question.
What you got?
Will you be covering mostly vegetables or also including herbs and flowers?
Mostly talking, I'm going to be generalizing, but mostly talking about vegetables. But you know, the concepts apply. Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and jump into it here. Once again, welcome everybody who's filtering in since we kind of just started and we got more people coming. Super excited to have a lot of interest in the topic tonight. We have over 200 people registered, and that's amazing. If you don't know me, my name is Keto Pilak. I've been working with Keep Growing Detroit. I've been working in urban agriculture for 13 years now. And I coordinate our education programming and I teach our beekeeping program, amongst other things. And tonight's topic, if I can get the slide to move forward. Come on, slide. There. Tonight's topic is creating a planting plan, crop selection, scheduling, and succession for the home garden. And we're going to be using, this is actually one of our co-directors, Ashley, this is her garden. We're going to be using this as an example of
Mr. Keto
aid. Yes.
Are you going to record this?
It is recording currently. Yes, it'll be.
Okay,
we'll have it recorded. Yep, for sure. Please, I absolutely want to talk to everybody, but because we have so many people registered, please channel your questions to the chat, and Lola's going to help keep on top of those as we go. Okay. So there's a lot to consider. The idea here is that the more, once we get a little bit of gardening experience under our belt from being a beginner, the next step is to start to think ahead and make a plan ahead of time, or have some ideas at the very least of what you're going to do ahead of time. And that way you can maximize the harvest that you get out of your garden. And you can also do a lot with strategy to make it easier, maybe less work. There's lots of layers to it. So hopefully I'm going to cover enough material that will give you some ideas to work with. I'll also be sharing after the class. I have some reference materials and documents that you could be using in the future that I will share. I will email you guys afterward. That might be helpful. So from the beginning, I'm going to ask you guys to, there's some questions and prompts as we go along. Could you please try and, in your own way, not that you're going to have to report them out or anything, but just to as another way of kind of engaging with the information, if you could take some time and jot down answers to some of these questions. So in this case, who are you growing for? What do you love to do? Do you want it to be, do you want for now, for the immediate use? Do you want to have bulk to freeze? Do you want to be preserving things? Do you want to grow? Are you just growing for yourself? Are you growing for yourself and your family? Are you growing for yourself and your neighbors? Or are you just growing for your neighbors because you only like tomatoes and, and you don't like much else out of the garden? I mean, there's a whole spectrum, okay? Start to think those things through. Here's a general overview of what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're going to be discussing, how we, just going through a little bit of documenting the space that you have to work with, how big your garden is, and how to, build or draw some kind of reference garden map so you have a sense of the space that you can work with in a visual aid. We'll be talking about crop mix. Crop mix is like, what are all the things that you're going to grow from now through October and beyond? And then we're going to get to, how much can we actually fit in the space that we're working with and ways to come up with that information. And then we'll talk about how to build that into when to plant it through a schedule. And once we have the main schedule, how to figure out things like succession planting things after a certain crop is finished, or you're done with it, taking it out, harvesting it, whatnot, and putting into, planting the next round. And then some tips on rotation, so we're not planting the same thing in the same spot year after year for your soil's health. And then some tips on, extending the growing season. Okay, so up in the corner, upright, top right corner here is a little sketch, and we'll see bigger pictures of this as we go on. But this is a little sketch of Ashley's garden. It's got the dimensions on the beds there. So first, one of the baseline of what you want to know is how much actual growing space do you have to work with. I'm not talking about paths or any of that stuff. That's not so important to document on a map. It's just the space that you're actually putting your vegetables in the ground. So for example, if you were, you have, 3 raised beds in your backyard, and you have a side lot with 3 more raised beds, you could put all of those onto one map just to have a visual representation all in one place for referencing as you're building out your garden plan. So I suggest you make or draw a simple map. It could be a crude drawing. You don't have to have super good drawing skills. The idea here is, that that space, that drawing represents that particular garden. So like in the case of Ashley's drawing here, it may be relative to scale because that's the type of person Ashley is to have to scale, but it could be, those beds in the middle could have different, all these beds could have different numbers on them. But, she knows in relation to her house that there's those 2 shrubs at the bottom there that are right up next to her house. And next to that are those 2, beds that are parallel to her house. And those are going to be represented. And we're going to use these kind of designations and put titles on them. So again, this is a picture of the garden to get a sense of the space. And then these are the measurements that, that Ashley put together of those spaces. I put this slide in here just for your future reference. If you want to print out this slide, you can use this to draw out your garden beds. But before, I'm going to come back to that in a second. And in this case, Ashley named the beds alphabetically. You can name them however makes sense to you. You could give them names like alpha, beta, kappa, or whatever, or the names of all the pets you've had in your life. Get creative with it. But the idea here is that you're going to use that designation down the road when you're drawing out, like, I'm going to plant such and such in bed A, and such, and radishes in bed B, and tomatoes in bed C, and so forth. So when you're making shorthand notation, you can reference the map and you know where things go. If you decide to do, you want to do something more to scale, you can use something like graph paper. And the idea here is that one of these squares would represent a certain amount of area. So depending on the size of your garden, you can say your garden was 20 feet wide. Then you can use this graph paper and do probably 1 square per foot. 1 square represents 1 square foot. So if you had, it was 20 wide and 40 long, then you could have, 20 squares down and 40 squares across. And that's, a scale representation of what your garden is. So graph paper is useful in that way. We'll talk more about how you can maybe use that map, as the actual plan. Is one way to do it, and making copies of it for the different parts of the season. We'll go into that a little more in detail later. So again, this is our beds with titles on them, A, B, C, D, E, and so forth. So we've designated our area. We've set up our map. We have a good representation of what space we're working with. Now we're thinking about crop mix. So what do you want to grow this year? So here's another prompt. If you could take some time and write a list of the crops that you want to grow. Again, this is more of an exercise than anything else. But if you're, as you're going through the class, you can think this through more. Here's some things to consider. We always encourage people to try something new. If you've never tasted it before, even if it's like you like green beans, but you've never had yard-long beans, or you've heard okra was good, but you've never actually tried it, or you love collard greens, but you've never really eaten kale. That's probably not true, but in any case, there's try something new. Consider crops that you haven't tried before. The next is and we're going to kind of get into this a little bit more, but here's some things to kind of dig in on. Consider the days to harvest. Is it a long season variety or a short season variety? That would be a column that would, after you've kind of written down your list. And we have some reference materials that will help you with this as we go through here. I'll talk about them a little bit more, but we're going to give them a designation. Is it a short season or a long season crop? When is it planted? It would be a third column. So is it planted? Can you plant it now? Is it a cold crop that you would plant, in April? Or is it something that needs to be planted after the last frost, like hot crops? Or is it something that you can grow all season long, like beets? And now, I'm going to keep going here, but we'll say go through at this point, once you've created this exhaustive list, go through your list and choose a top 4 or 8 varieties that you can't live without. We're going to call those the bones of your plan, the things that you can't live without, because more times than not, you want to grow more things that you have space for. It's just, there's so many vegetables to grow, and it's, it's so exciting to try different things. And so this is kind of something that'll help us narrow down the space that we have to work with, and make sure we get the things that are most important to us. And then we're going to figure out where and when we're going to plant, get them on the calendar. So we'll take a minute. We're going to take a pause here and reflect on last year. I know some of you are new to gardening, and that's fine. But if you did garden last year, or if you've been gardening for years, this is a very valuable slide, because I think this is a tool that I use every year, usually in the fall. Is basically, what did we grow this year? How many did we grow of it, and was it enough? Like, I grew 5 collard plants, and I really probably only needed 2 because, you know, my family likes collards, but they don't like collards that much. Or I grew 6 tomato plants and I really wanted to can those tomatoes and there wasn't enough. There's a number of factors involved here. Some years are better for, you know, for some crops than others. You know, like some year you'll have a, you know, some years you'll have a bumper crop of beans. And then the next year you'll plant the same amount of beans and, you know, you won't get as much of a crop. But there's got to be a baseline, and the previous year is a really great reference for what you want to do next. And, you know, continue to answer any of these questions is really helpful. You know, what did well, and trying to, you know, trying to narrow this down. You know, the garden tells us a lot. And, you know, I think interacting it and making notes, even, you know, having a notebook of your garden plan and periodically jotting down like when things are going really well or not so great and why, or why you think they are anyways, can help you, particularly if you're dealing with problems, can help you start to narrow down what's causing the problem. Any questions, Lola?
Sure. One question that came up earlier is, what's the best way to get dirt into a raised garden bed?
Wheelbarrow or
Yeah, that's
buckets.
someone else.
Yeah. Anything particularly on what we're talking about right now?
There's a question about crop rotation.
We're definitely going to get into crop rotation a little later.
Okay,
So
cool.
Is it okay if I further on the question that I had about the dirt? If that's okay? Or what?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's a lot of beds, and the height is about 20 inches tall. And I was using a wheelbarrow, so I was just wondering if there was like a easier way, if anybody had any hints.
Yeah, I mean, I think wheelbarrows, if you had some strong people and, you know, and 2 per wheelbarrow, when you pull it up to the edge and then 2 of them together could lift it and tilt it in, that would be the most efficient. Aside from that, it's going to be dig in and dig out.
Suggestion on what I did, because I had to do it myself too. Put a big tarp in the wheelbarrow. You can only fill it as much as you can lift that tarp, but it was a lot easier than shoveling single shovelfuls into the.
Yeah. So fill the wheelbarrow maybe halfway and then you can lift it yourself.
Well,
You
or
lean it on the bed.
I actually had a tarp in the wheelbarrow, and then I could fold up the tarp and dump it into the bed instead, but
Great.
I could get more shovels at a time.
Great.
Can I make a suggestion? Depending on the height, just make a ramp. You can roll it up to the edge, dump it, and then roll it back off the ramp.
Yeah, even if it wasn't all the way to the top, you know,
Yep.
maybe like on some cinder blocks or something.
Yep.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so continuing this conversation about what happened last year, and in this case, this is just a scenario of what, you know, this is a scenario of what was planted last year. You'll see peppers and eggplant, herbs and flowers, basil, blah, blah, blah. And then, you know, in the case with the darker colored words, that's a situation where it was a succession. So after broccoli, cabbage, kale, cabbage, broccoli, Brussels sprouts was another round of broccoli in part of that bed. And, you know, the scenario was eggplant, watermelon, and Brussels sprouts didn't really get used. And then, you know, and that's just, you know, going down the list, what did you wish you had more of? Salad greens and cooking greens. So these are all these notes of like, I'm going to add more, you know, less of the eggplant, less of the watermelon. I'm not going to do Brussels sprouts next year. That's on the not gonna do list. And then the I'm gonna do list is I'm making more room for salad greens. I'm making more room for cooking greens. And then, you know, what did well, of course, you know, we talked about that. And what didn't do well, cabbage, and maybe that's another note that you make. Try and figure out why I didn't grow, you know, what did I not do good with the cabbage? Where was it located? Did it get enough sun? Did it get enough nutrients, and so on and so forth? So we try and help you, you know, take some of the mystery out of putting your planting plan together. And we put together we call it Plan Your Garden document every year. This is the 2021 version. So it gives you the list of all the things that we're going to be distributing this year, and during what distributions. So this can help when we're creating those lists, like we were talking about earlier, of our favorites and so forth. And you know, this is available on our website. And if you look, it's right in the same space where the Garden Resource Program application is, and like on the same page. So you can look for it there. And then next, I just wanted to make a point that, particularly if you're newer to gardening, to look at each of these crops like the people you know in your life, that they're different. They have their unique qualities. Some of them, you know, like to be out. You know, my cousin is a big outdoorsman, and my other cousin spends all his time playing video games. Like, and crops are you know, have the similar, you know, have comparable, not exactly, have kind of an analogous characteristics, where some like it cold, some like it hot, some only take a short time to grow, some take a long time to grow, some germinate in just a few days, some take a couple weeks to germinate, some you could harvest in you know, 35 days. This is, you know, similar to long season, short season, but days to harvest are, you know, some, it's like radishes are 25 days to harvest, and beans are 65 days to harvest. And you know, this is the next one I would say is particularly important if you're working with a small area, or you know, an area that's got any kind of light limitations, whether that be trees or fences or whatever. Getting to know what the mature size of this plant is going to be. Like, for instance, tomato plants get to be 6-7 feet tall, and if you plant things right next to them or in the shadow of, you know, in the main sun of the day, that's gonna impact the other things that you're trying to grow next to those tomatoes. And then, you know, and then get to know what crops are ideal for succession planting. And we're going to dive into what succession planting is a little bit more as we go along here. So you know, after you've kind of figured out the bones of your garden, the heart, the core, those top 4 to 8 crops, next, you know, consider filling in the space with your, you know, that weren't on your A list, but you still want to add them. Some things that are long season, like melons or squashes. And then finally, we're going to fill in the open spaces with short season crops or successions. And if you don't understand all I'm saying right now, don't worry about it. I'm going to get into it more in detail as we go. So on the back side of this Plan Your Garden doc that I was talking about earlier, this one is this reference chart, which I'm going to show a little closer here. And this is a really valuable tool for general reference. So this helps us with knowing if it's a short season crop or a long season crop, because we're learning the days to harvest. So for instance, you know, baby leaf lettuce mix is 28 days to harvest, and you can start to harvest them. But but once we're getting to know the characteristics of that lettuce, we know that it's 28 days till you can start harvesting it. And then you can probably harvest it for another 2 weeks. So we're talking more like 52 days until the crop is more or less done, something to that effect. So that's in getting to know that crop. Whereas beets are more, a little more like one and done, so to speak, where you plant the beet, or approximately 60 days later, you will have a mature beet. You pull it out of the ground, and now that space is available to plant something else. So this is something, as we're planning these, this is valuable information. And to this is really also useful for just a quick reference for particularly with seeds on this page. This is the seed page, and then the next one is going to be talking about the transplants. So on this page, we're talking about the spacing of those seeds. If you see the asterisks, those plants also need to be thinned down to give them space to grow out. And then the chart to the left, the chart to the right is gives you a general sense of when it's ideal to plant these things outdoors. So for instance, arugula does not like really hot weather. It really prefers cool weather. And so we're planting, arugula we could be starting to plant now, and into May. Take June, July, and even in this case, I might even take August off, and then plant it again, later in the fall. Whereas beets, we could be planting that all season long. Or carrots, we can be planting those all season long. So really valuable tool. Again, this is available on our website on our Plan Your Garden doc. And then this next, I just broke up the slide here, this chart that's on the back of that. And this is the plants that we're distributing. And again, these, you can see that most of these are longer harvest days. Basil, bok choy, etc. And just really want to pay attention to spacing, and it's going to be really helpful to know how much you can fit in the area that you're hoping to occupy in that map that you've created. Okay. Any questions?
One quick question. Will you be covering bed prep in this presentation?
No, we're specifically just talking, focused on garden planning for this one, and thinking through all of the, the working parts of that. We will be going into bed prep in detail at the basic gardening class next week, Saturday, the 3rd. So stay tuned for that, or you can also catch the YouTube video after the fact on that one. So the next question to contemplate when you're planting your garden is, how much do I want to plant of each crop? I think when you're first starting out, it is perfectly acceptable and expected, and you should just plant, what you think you should, or start small, start with a few things. But we quickly learned that, if I have one packet of bush bean seed right here. Like, actually, you were looking at my slides, but in any case, one packet of seeds is got 20, 30 seeds in it. That's enough to cover a large area of planting. So we got to get to practically, like, I don't want to just grow beans. Like, I like beans, but I want more than beans. I want tomatoes, I want lettuce, I want collards, I want kale, I want beets, I want carrots. I want I want a lot of things. We got to make sure that we have the space, figure out, and, but even more so on some level, it would be really nice to know, well, I mean, I don't know how much, I don't know if I want 1 bean plant or 3 bean plants. How do I know? I haven't planted a garden before, or I only did, or I haven't planted beans before. So in this case, there's a few different resources that we can use that will tell us yield or how much harvest to expect from a plant or from a certain amount of area. You can look in seed catalogs, and most of the time, they're just as a caveat. Most of the time, these are just estimates. Yields can vary widely based on numbers of factors, including soil quality and stuff, but it's a good starting place. I did want to note here that if you're dealing with a really small space or you have limited space, to consider that, some crops only have a little harvest or like cabbage, for instance. You take a cabbage takes up, 2 by 2 area, approximately 1 cabbage plant, and you get, after 65 days or however, you get 1 head of cabbage. And I love cabbage. I love making coleslaw. I love making sauerkraut. But to me, in my own garden at home, that's not worth the space. Like, I'd rather, grow tomatoes in that space or beans in that space or what have you. So Brussels sprouts is a similar one. Like, the return on investment in terms of space is small, but if you love Brussels sprouts, you should grow them. I mean, just a note. So one resource for yield, based on 100-foot rows, which you can kind of deduce from, is the Johnny Seed catalog. This is usually in the front of the Johnny Seed catalog. It's also on their website. So in this case, looking at, what's a good example here? So radishes, we'll say. Small radishes, 100-foot row of radishes. That's 1 row. Can you guys tell me, can you see me right now, or you just see my screen? Do you see?
I can see you too, the way.
Okay, great. Because I'm just like, I'm doing things with my hands, and I don't, hopefully that they'll be helpful visual aids, and didn't know.
I see you as well as the screen very clearly.
Great, perfect. So 1 row means like 1 line. So your rows are 3 foot wide, 4 foot wide, or whatever. So if you did a whole bed, say a 25-foot long bed, and you did 4 rows of cabbages, or 4 rows of radishes, then you have 100 row feet of radishes, and your yield is 100 bunches, as an example. Or you could deduce that down into, smaller areas. So that kind of helps. It's not perfect for the small gardener. Here's another one of estimated yield per square foot. And this is 2 pages of it. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but you'll have this for future reference when I share the slides with you. So, just as example here, for celery, oh, of course, celery was the one I picked, and that's not available. Cucumbers, you can get 0.2 pounds of cucumbers per square foot. So you get, 1/4 pound of cucumbers per square foot. So if you want to, you want to be harvesting 10 pounds of cucumbers, you can plan accordingly. And it's just, it's a point of reference. It helps figure out, like, particularly like if you wanted to make pickles for, your 10 best friends, and you knew you wanted a pound per, and so on and so forth, you can figure out the calculations for your homemade pickle business. And here's some more reference, as well. So, and then the next night, I spoke this already, but just to kind of review a little bit, how many plants or seeds do you need to get the desired yield? So, let's see, Johnny's helps with that some. Extrapolating, 100 feet down to, 10 feet is, maybe a little, it should work reasonably well, but it, maybe needs some adjusting over time. But, after you gain more and more experience with this year after year, it'll, it'll become somewhat intuitive because you've done it, gone through it, had a sense of how much seed you needed to yield a particular amount of, crop. And we talked about spacing. One other thing I wanted to mention here is, generally speaking, it's really a helpful tool when you're planting out a garden to plant in blocks or rows. So what I mean by blocks, let's see if I can, just in this slide here, if you could just reference like the bottom left, for example, is a block of cucumbers. That's 4 cucumber plants, and a block of peppers with 4 pepper plants. So instead of, cucumber, pepper, that helps in some cases. It's not, by no means is it a law or you have to do it. In some cases that it's actually a good idea to break that rule, but generally speaking, to put likes with likes together, one, helps kind of consolidate managing light. So like if you have tall plants and all the tall plants are together, you can put them in a space that they're not shading out the other plants. And 2, it helps with rotation. So, those crops will be taking out similar nutrients. So you're not, if you rotate them out of that space for next year, then it helps diversify that. There are a few cases where, it maybe makes sense to spread things out. We've been experimenting with some, because of our light limitations in my home garden, we've been experimenting with spreading out some of those tall plants because of the way the light hits our garden. It is less of an issue with shade in that circumstance, the way that we are able to plant things and still get them to get light. So it's food for thought. Another reference that we put out every year that hopefully is helpful to you guys is our planting instructions that we send out with our cold crops and hot crops and fall crops. And these are just generally good for reference, but I wanted to just point out here that we try and help out a little bit with knowing how much space that those plants will take up. So in the case here, I'm just giving the example of this lettuce pack, that if you're planting the lettuces 6 to 8 inches apart, excuse me, that they will occupy approximately a 2 foot by 2 foot area. And that will help you build out your map. Just a quick note, as you're building out your garden plan, it's good to think about not only those vegetables, but in particular, flowers that will attract pollinators. So there are some flowers that we include with the garden resource program that help with that, like zinnias, and sunflowers. I know that we're doing this year, but perennial flowers are really, I'm not going to get into a detailed list, but there are a bunch of perennial flowers that are really great for attracting pollinators. So that there's and beneficial insects. So just a quick note about that. So that's they help provide pollination. They are habitat for beneficial insects that may help with pest pressures. The general philosophy of this is that a diverse garden with lots of flowers flowering at all times of the year and lots of different types of vegetation and plant life will prevent any one, in this case, insect population or pest population from dominating. And then, you know, there will, in some cases, you know, we're inviting beneficial insects that are going to parasitize or eat up some of those bad bugs. You know, and then also, you know, perennial fruit is just, you know, a super exciting thing to have at certain times of the year. There's nothing like that first strawberry out of the garden, or raspberries, or peaches, or, you know, the list goes on. So, and the consideration there is that those plants are going to be, one, there year after year, and two, they're in some cases going to provide, you know, affect the light or the shade out in certain parts of your garden. So that's something to consider when you're setting out the placement of the garden. So we're working out a plan, and you know, this is one way to do it, with, you know, with little drawings. It's probably not so practical, but it could be as simple, you know, if you're doing this kind of map concept, as writing in the name of the crop in the particular area. So there are a few examples of a planting plan that I want to share. You could take, let's see if I did it. Okay, yeah, okay. So you could build out something similar to this if you have access to Excel or any kind of spreadsheet. I could share, I'm going to be sharing the document for this for those of you who might be interested. But regardless, or you could actually take this as a blank document and print it off and just fill it in by hand. But the idea here is to use a spreadsheet to build out the entire year into a calendar. I'm going to go into, I know it's a little bit hard to see, but I just want to look at the whole year to give you the concept here. So each column, the rows going downward represent the weeks of the months of the year. So, you know, in this case, I am planting lettuce in the second week of April. And then the rows going across represent the sections. I broke my raised beds into, you know, in my pretend garden here, I broke the raised beds into 4 sections. And so now I know that, like, I have my reference map, and I can say, in the first bed in 1A, in April 15th, I'm planting lettuce. In 1B, I'm planting beets. In 1C, I'm planting carrots. And then a little bit later, I'm planting collards and kale. So what the beauty of this, in my mind, is that you have a representation, But then you can know that in 1A, and here I'll go down here so you can see slightly better. You know that in 1A, after the lettuce comes out, head lettuce, approximately 50 days later, I can plant bush beans. I'm going to give it a little break, but in the middle of June, I can plant my next crop that's going to always keep something growing in my garden. So, and so I got those bush beans going. And the H represents when the harvest begins. So like, for example, with the tomatoes down in 2A, those are going to start in hot and heavy in July. So, and this is by no means a perfect planting plan. I mean, you're welcome to use it as reference. And again, I will be sharing the slides. But it gives a really good idea. I think this is a perfect tool, and this also really helps out for growing on a larger scale. But maybe you look at this and you're like, spreadsheets, no spreadsheets for me. I don't like it. Some people like see this and they're like, it just like turns their eye, my eyes glaze over immediately. So there are other ways to do it. You could take your simple garden map, like this drawing here, draw it out, to the best of your ability, give those beds those names, and then make photocopies of the garden. Because, what want to encourage here in particular is that I think the concept, or the classic, or a very common way of planting a garden is you plant it once at the beginning of the spring, and that's it. You plant you put your cold crops in April, you put your hot crops in May, and that's that. Like, there's no other, but the reality is these things each have lifespans of, so in theory, like if for instance, that you're going to be planting your tomatoes in bed E in the middle of May, you could occupy that space with a short season crop like arugula or lettuce or radishes, or something, 25, 30 days, have that crop in and out before you even, plant your tomatoes. So you could either write you could write the name of the crop in those areas, or, or have a list, a list next to it with a reference for each one of them.
Hey, Keto.
Yeah.
What were the different gradations of color indicating in the, there?
Oh, it was, honestly, I don't remember. I made this a few years ago. I think it was just so it wasn't a whole block of gray. But I don't think there was anything, because the spinaches are all the same, or there's spinach all happening late in the season, for instance. And I think it was just so it didn't look like a block of gray. I was trying to show that, I guess, to illustrate the line going across. So your eye was drawn into the line going across, not to like this big block of gray. Any other questions?
Will you in the spreadsheets that you've shown, or just in slide form?
No, the actual spreadsheets.
Oh, sweet. Okay, cool.
Okay, another way to do it, and it could be in combination with your map list, is, to give designations for these crops. And then, grab an old school calendar that's in a place that's very commonly, like in your kitchen, for instance, like some place that you go every day. And like if you're like me, I'm visually stimulated. Like I try all the things I know I need to take care of I have to like interact with them, or I'll forget about them. So having, that calendar like that's out in front of you, and you look at it and you're like, oh, it's a reminder. I gotta check on what I'm planting my next thing. This is another useful tool, similar to, the planting map. So now let's spend a little bit of time talking about crop rotation. So like I was talking about earlier, there are each crop has unique characteristics, and a lot of them fall into categories of families. So for instance, tomatoes and eggplant and peppers and potatoes are all in the same family, the solanaceous family or the nightshade family. So when you're thinking about rotation, and this is another reason to plant in blocks, is that you want to rotate those families into not planting them in the same spot year after year after year. It's a little difficult when you're growing on a small scale, because sometimes we're just growing 1 or 2 of something and then 10 of something else. So it doesn't equal out. So I'm more of an advocate for I'm more of an advocate for just, trying to just be conscious of not planting the same thing in the same spot year after year. And also amending your soil with compost or organic fertilizer, rebuilding your soil, reintroducing fertility as time goes on will help, alleviate any kind of issues related to that. But to illustrate the concept here, on the left-hand slide, we see, a representation of, some of the nightshades with the peppers and the eggplant, and then herbs at the top, and then lettuces and greens, and then down below here in the next slide, we see the rotation from the 2020 crop families into the 2021. So they were just it's moving in a circular rotation. It doesn't have to be in a particular circular rotation, whatever makes sense to you or is convenient, but this seems to make sense, generally for most folks. So we talked through succession a bit. Season extension is using methods to extend the growing season beyond what we typically know as our growing season. So, for instance, we are most familiar with starting our gardens now. I mean, most years we're not even able to, we're still getting, I think we were still having snow now and into April. But last frost date is typically May. People often start their gardens by the middle of April. And then gardening more or less is done by October. But we'll, actually, let me, yeah. So we'll get into some tips and techniques for season extension in a few slides here. I'll just kind of keep it in mind here. So types of succession planting and like this slide of the garden planting plan example. This is a really beautiful, in my mind, way to illustrate how a succession can happen. Either you're starting the season with a short crop, like the scenario I gave earlier, with trying to grow some radishes before you put your tomatoes in the ground, or early season peas before other warm season crops like eggplants. So I think as a general theme here, you're going to be planting hot crops, and you can't plant your hot crops till the middle of May. So if you have the opportunity and the space to grow something short season before them, that's a really good scenario to play around with. Another way of doing succession planting is to plant specifically based on the harvest that you want to have. Like you love carrots, but you don't want 100 pounds of carrots at once. You want the carrots for your salad every week. And you know that you want a handful of carrots each week. So what you can do in that scenario with succession is to plant carrots. So we'll use this we'll plant some carrots in the middle of March. And then 2 weeks later, I'm sorry, you plant now in the middle of March, but you plant only 1 square foot or 2 square foot, or the first section of your raised bed, or a first section of your garden, a smaller area, kind of anticipating that this will be a dozen carrots, so approximating or using your reference materials as I had addressed earlier. And then 2 weeks later, plant the carrots again, same amount, and so on and so forth. And that will stagger your harvest times. So you'll can be continuously pulling carrots out of the ground. The finicky thing about succession, or something to consider or play around with in your mind, is at some point in the growing of a particular plant, it's kind of done, or it's still alive, or it's still growing, or it's still producing, but it's not robust. And you could maybe maximize the potential of that particular crop if you pulled it out and started something new. One example of this is I think it's a big tradition for folks to grow collard greens for Thanksgiving dinner. Like, it's a big thing with Thanksgiving dinner. But in that case, you don't have to plant, but you're planting your collard greens in April. You don't need to leave them. I mean, they will grow all season, and you will still have enough to do a harvest for Thanksgiving. But if that was your particular focus, you could plant those collard greens late in the season, like say July, like we distribute collards in July, or slightly sooner, and still have a beautiful harvest of maybe even better quality collards, because it's a younger plant, and the leaves will be maybe more tender. So there is a time in the season, particularly like when we're, getting it towards the end of the season, and we're going to be talking about season extension in a minute, that, it's, we know we want to plant something where the tomatoes are, but the tomatoes are still kind of hanging on, and, there's still a lot of green tomatoes on there, but it's getting cooler out, and they're just kind of like, at some point, tomatoes are, as the example, are, they're not going to do a whole bunch more ripening on the vine. So maybe better off, pull the plants, pull all those green tomatoes off, either eat them as green tomatoes or put them in a paper bag and ripen them for later, and then plant something else. And that, using the techniques we're going to talk about for season section. A tool for succession planting that I wanted to share with you guys is this pre-made spreadsheet that helps fill in the dates for planting. So you can kind of pair this with a calendar. So you would fill in this information. This, I'm going to give this to you with this current information on it, and you can populate it. Actually, I'm going to share that screen. Oops. You share this one. Okay. Okay. So, so for example, you got to change. This is old dates, but you have to fix the dates of. So, for instance, here we'll do 21, and that changes all the dates through the column. Or it should change all the dates through the column. Yeah, it does, except for the last one. But in any case, you populate the name of your crop, the days to maturity that you know. So if I knew that this was 55 days to maturity, or 60 days to maturity, and so on and so forth. And then you want the intervals between the succession that you want to do. So how often do you want to be harvesting those beets. Do you want to do every 14 days, every 10 days, or whatever? And then, you know, as you adjust these numbers, that changes all the other dates down the row. And then you can put those in your calendar as planting beans, you know, for instance, however often, you know, you just put on your calendar for May 1st, May 15th, May 29th, that those are all the bean planting days. So that's a kind of a useful tool. I will be, again, sharing that after the class for you to use. All these things, if you don't happen to have, you know, just as a side note, if you don't have Word or, you know, or Microsoft, most, I'm pretty sure that all these spreadsheets can be opened in Google Docs these days. So Google is a useful tool for that. Okay, so season extension. Now, so again, to reiterate, the concept of season extension is to be able to extend the growing season earlier in the spring and later in the fall. So the limiting factor for the limiting factors for plant growth are soil temperature, or soil and ambient temperature, amount of sunlight, and then the other things like you know, soil nutrients we can manage, water we can manage. So the main two things that are limiting factors of vegetables actively growing are temperature and light. So we're trying to figure out, you know, we're with using the concept of season extension, where, you know, in the cool season, we're looking at what can germinate well in cool temperatures, and what are things that need less light. So generally speaking, all cold or cool loving crops tend to be leafing and rooting crops, and warm and generally speaking, and the things that love heat or warm season are fruiting crops. You know, there's definitely deviations from that, but that's a good rule of thumb. So if we're trying to start our garden early, we know that we can't grow at this time of year. We know that we can't grow hot crops when it's colder than, you know, if there's any anticipation of freezing, or if there's, you know, extended periods below 50 degrees. But spinach, for example, germinates really well in cool temperatures, lettuce, mustards, and, you know, and then there's a few others here. Peas are kind of an anomaly to what I was saying, because technically they're a fruiting crop, but peas do well in cool soil. And then carrots and beets, those rooting crops. And then I didn't even write down radishes, but radish is another one. So, and, you know, the earlier you could even start some of these things indoors. And, you know, we didn't know 3 weeks ago that the weather is going to be like it is now. But you could anticipate that, you know, starting a few things indoors of this list, with the anticipation of, well, I know GRP is coming in the middle of April, but I have some beet seeds, and I have some lettuce seeds. I could start those, you know, get those sprouted a little bit, and oh my God, it's the middle of March and it's warm out, and, you know, warm enough, and I could pop those plants in the ground and really get a good crop. So you got to play around with that. You know, just a note on, you know, a little bit more of explaining the concept of season extension, or, you know, how to play with Mother Nature in this way, is that, you know, the earliest that we can really get things going is February, or the, you know, in terms of planting in the ground outdoors, or in some cases under like something like quick hoops or cold frame. or a hoop house, or, some of these bigger greenhouse type structures. The soonest we can really get things planted in the spring or in the beginning of the year, winter really, would be February. Usually like first or second week in February. And that's based on day length. So from about the middle of November, middle of November through the beginning of February, the day length dips below 10 hours of sunlight. And plants need that 10 hours of sunlight to actively grow. They will kind of peter along, maybe a little bit of growth out. These things, most of these things on this list could also tolerate some freezing or some mild frost. Having a row cover or some sheets or something, if we're expecting a snow or some frost, would help protect them a little bit. And then moving on, I just said that stuff. You can also, if you have protection, you can experiment. You can play around with trying to get like things like tomatoes or some of those hot crops planted earlier than those May dates. But you definitely need to have a plan for some kind of protection and acknowledge that you are taking a risk. They say the general rule of thumb is that May 10th is the last frost date. You should remember that. That's my birthday. And so, but we know that it changes from year to year. So it's just based on the averages over the past 50 years or whatever. So it could be April 29th. It could be May 15th. The way things have been going, it seems like earlier is more likely, more realistic, but that's that. So, this is just a kind of a reminder about, some maintenance and support techniques. So think about, things that you're going to need to do in terms of staking and trellising. I think at this point, we're going to take a minute and pause and open it up to questions while I take some water.
Do you want to start making our way through questions that have come up throughout the presentation?
Yeah, I think we're going to leave it there, and I want to give some time for questions. So let's open it up.
All right.
So let me say this: Lola's gonna go through the list and let me know. We're gonna go through the chat list and we're gonna answer those questions. And then looks like we're probably gonna have some time. It would be great to hear your voices. So if you want to chime in and speak in person and ask questions, I welcome that. So take it away, Lola.
Okay. So in small raised beds, should your plan include all vegetables rotated? Whoever asked that question, could you clarify a little bit?
I'm
That was
wondering.
Marguerite. It was
Yeah,
Marguerite.
go ahead. Yeah.
So I'm at North Community, Cass Community Garden, 8x6, I think is my box size. So I actually have two. Now, should every vegetable be switched around, or there's some that can be grown in the same space? Like I had cucumbers growing up a trellis and it gets the best sun. Do I still need to move the trellis to my other plot? And
yeah. At the very least, I would say every once in a while you should do that. Every couple years you should try and switch it up. I mean,
okay.
if you're like, man, that trellis is such a pain in the butt to move, and
It's not. It's pretty cool. It's easy. Yeah.
Okay. But if there was that circumstance of like, oh man, I can't, this is something that I need for this to grow. It's not the end of the world. It may impede, the quality of the crop, and and then you'll learn it. You'll know, like, oh man, that, last year those cucumbers were great, but I did them again in the same spot and now they're not doing so hot. And I know why now.
Okay, but ideally I should not just move them to the other side, like on the left side or the right side. Since I have two, I should move one set of vegetables to the other box or plot. You see what I mean? Since I
Yeah,
have
I think just
two.
move it. I mean, if you have, like, if you're growing, you could just move it over. It just doesn't want, you just don't want it in the same soil.
Oh, okay, then I will flip the plots then. Okay, all right, thanks.
Uh-huh.
Next question is, can you plant early/quick crops around your tomato plant since they take so long to grow?
Great. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up because it's a really great concept, which is actually illustrated in this picture on my screen right now. So you see that those lettuces right next to the tomato plant. There's a small tomato plant at the bottom. Lettuces. So if you're like, basically, if you know something's going to be big, but you're gonna, you think that you can get a crop in and out before it gets big, then it's perfect. Another example of something that you could play around with is, I'll use one example of this is there's different ways to do it with different crops, but if you plant, for instance, carrot seed next to lettuce seed, so you did, and this is breaking all the rules I've talked about almost, but you do a row of carrots and a row of lettuce and a row of carrots and a row of lettuce. Concept is the lettuce will germinate relatively quickly and leaf out, and maybe even help retain the moisture in the soil for those carrots, which take up to 2 weeks to germinate. And then, the lettuce, since the carrots will take the lettuce you'd be harvesting as baby greens, so it'll be done in 30 days or something, 35 days, 25 days, you start harvesting, 10 days later, you're done. Pull that out. The carrots are starting to really, get their bearings at that point, and then the carrots can flourish. Of course, you're going to thin them. Okay, next question.
When doing succession planting, do you pull up the previous plant to plant the new one?
Yes. Well, it depends, but I mean, yes, that's the concept. It's succession is, well, there's, I guess, two ways of succession. One is to reserve the open soil because 2 weeks, in short order, you're going to be planting there again the same crop to have that harvest as I was talking about. Or you're like, this soil is this crop at this time, and this soil is another crop right afterward. So you got to pull it up. So that's where it's finicky sometimes to be like, oh, there's still a few beans on this plant. Do I pull it up and plant something else, or do I wait? You got to challenge yourself in that way and be like, it's time for something else. Plant the next thing.
Yeah. Okay. When you were talking about germination rates, someone was wondering if that was for planting the seeds outside as opposed to germination inside.
Well, there's germination rate, and then there's days to germination. Okay, so I'm not sure.
I think
I said what?
Days to germination.
Okay. So that's for planting seeds. It's both. I mean, it's useful information whether you're starting seeds indoors or you're planting in the ground outdoors. But carrots are a perfect example where carrots take up to 2 weeks to germinate. And if you didn't know that, you could plant the carrots and be like, the heck? These seeds aren't germinating. So it's just useful information, you know, to strategize if you're going to be planting, intercropping it with another crop, or, you know, to play around with the dates and the planting dates and all that kind of stuff. So that's why, you know, it's helpful and useful.
Cool. How long do seeds typically last for? And I guess a good question to tack onto that too is, what's the best way to store seeds?
Okay, store seeds cool, dark, and dry. So it doesn't, you know, refrigerator is great, but not all of us have the room in our refrigerator. So like you know, jar or a box that's well sealed, you could put it in your basement or in a closet or in a cabinet, but just generally away from moisture, away from sunlight, and trying to avoid temperatures above, you know, super hot, not next to your stove or whatever. How long do seeds last? It varies from seed variety to seed variety. But as the year, you know, like we know that like there are seeds that were found from thousands of years ago that are, you know, that have been found to be viable, but you know, that doesn't always apply, and maybe that was partially how they were preserved, you know, incidentally. But you know, generally speaking, every year the quality of the seed diminishes. So whereas, you know, when we buy seeds, they have to be at least 75% germination rate, which means that if you try to germinate 100 seeds, 75 of them would germinate. And I would expect that each year, you know, it to decrease. So like if you plant out a whole row of, you know, spinach from 5-year-old seed and only 30% of it germinates, that's why.
Cool. And then one quick example of that is, if you get a packet of arugula seeds this year, would you be able to plant them next year? Probably, right? I think there's some, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say from like, if you got a year-old seed or a couple-year-old seed, they're probably going to do probably okay. Just maybe plant a little more.
Yeah, I know for our seed choices this year, we're including some of the donated seeds, and I believe those are a year old, but they're good. They've been in cold, dry, dark storage for a year. So, could you explain what you mean by thinning?
Yeah, thinning is so it relates to germination rates on some, in some ways, and it also relates to just trying to save labor. So the idea is that you would plant using, you know, the recommendations. Hold on, let me see. So in the case of every one of these on this page, that there's an asterisk next to it. So beets and carrots, cucumbers, okra, spinach, radishes, they're suggesting that you plant so many seeds, like for in the case of beets, plant the beets 1 inch apart, you know, in a row, in a line. You're planting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Once they germinate, and this is the counterintuitive part, is that you should thin them to that appropriate spacing that, you know, usually it doesn't say on this sheet, but in the other instructions, in the planting instructions, you know, we give you thin to, you know, such and such distance apart. You can also kind of imagine if I'm planting a beet seed and then 1 inch over, I'm planting another beet. You know how big a beet is. A beet is 3 inches in diameter at least, or 2 to 3 inches. then, you know, you got to have enough real estate, enough space. I'm making gang sign too. You got to have enough space, you know, for those beets to grow out. So, and then usually, you know, people are wondering, well, what can you do with those thinning? You know, you pull out those plants in between. What do you do with those? You can, in some cases, you can try and replant them. Rooting crops like radishes and beets and carrots tend not to do so well because they don't like their roots to be just, you know, disturbed, because that's the, you know, the bulk of the plant is the root. But you can do it with other things like spinach. You could, for instance, all of the, you know, most all of the thinnings could be eaten as a snack or thrown in a salad as well.
Yeah. Especially like beet greens. So
Oh,
I
yeah,
remember
yeah,
taking
beet
home
greens.
like
Yeah.
more beet greens than I knew what to do with when we were thinning the beets at the farm. So, are there any seeds that you can germinate outdoors now?
Yeah, that list. Spinach, I would definitely, spinach is like the all-star, you know, crop for this time of year. Lettuce, peas, beets, carrots. I would try all those things. I planted all those things in my garden last weekend.
Yes, there's a cute video of June on our Instagram planting peas.
Yeah, right, my daughter. Thanks. Nice.
Okay. Someone was wondering if we use square foot gardening as a teaching tool.
We haven't. I think that it's got merits. You know, if that's something that you're interested in, I think it's great.
Cool.
Similar, I think some of the concepts I talked about today.
Are rows or blocks better for different kinds of crops or spaces? Or is it just a preference?
I don't know if I understand the question. Do rows or blocks work better for some crops and not for others? Is that the question?
Yeah, like or is it just like a personal preference or a design, an aesthetic preference to plant in blocks versus rows?
I would say it's a practical. I see it as a practical thing. I mean, it is an aesthetic thing too. You know, people like to see, you know, just like when you're planting annuals, you know, blocks of annuals have more visual appeal. But it's a maintenance thing. It's a light management thing. Because like, you know, you get to know like the water needs of some crops. Like some things don't need to be watered as frequently as others. And, you know, if you have a thirsty thing next to a not so thirsty thing, or thing that like doesn't want its feet wet, and you're like trying to water one, and you know, so it's more of a management thing, is what I would say.
Okay. We talked about rotation in raised beds. Is there anything that should not be planted after another crop? And also to that point too, are there certain crops that do well next to each other and certain crops that you should not plant next to each other?
Another aspect of getting to know some of the crops, you'll learn that some of them are heavier feeders, like they tend to take a lot out of the soil. So for instance, you know, tomatoes are heavy feeders, and cabbages are heavy feeders, and some of the, I'm not going to get into an exhaustive list, but getting to know, like, if it's a heavy feeder, then you probably want to follow it with something that's not a heavy feeder, like something with a shallower root system, for example, lettuces. There are some recommendations of what not to plant after another. I don't have them fresh on the top of my mind to give any good examples other than talking about feeding. So I think that would just, I might reference, there's a really good vegetable book, the Vegetable Growers Handbook, I think it's called, Vegetable Growers Handbook. Eric Tozer, that might be a good resource.
Cool. Does crop rotation still apply if you're using cover crops fall through spring?
I think technically, yes. I mean, it's a factor to think about. Cover crops are great, and they are reintroducing if you till them in. So that, in that situation, I would be maybe slightly less concerned about rotating, because essentially you are rotating in a cover crop into the mix, and then you're rotating onto, I guess, on some large farm operations, that's what they do, is like, year on, year off of one crop or another. They go over here this year and over here the other year. And so if you're kind of splitting that up and reintroducing nutrients and organic material, organic matter, then it sounds like a reasonable move.
Cool. What type of inorganic fertilizer do you recommend?
Non-organic?
Sure.
It's not really something that I've pursued, so I don't have a really good recommendation. I'm really focused, I think generally Keep Growing Detroit is very focused on not only growing, supporting people in growing crops, but considering the underlying principles of why, like, we're not certified organic, and we're not encouraging people to become certified organic, but we're encouraging people to think about the entire ecosystem of the implications of how we do our gardening, and living soil or soil health is a huge part of that. Where, with organic systems and the organic approach, the concept is to feed the soil, and the soil feeds the plants. Whereas some of these inorganic fertilizers or non-organic fertilizers are, like, basically they are a direct line to the plant, which can produce, amazing results and good looking plants. But in effect, you're also impacting the soil health over time, particularly over time. So, there could be repercussions of using inorganic fertilizers over time and on the quality of your soil. And
Pilak? Mr. Pilak?
yes.
The second part that you said about soil health, usually the inorganic materials or fertilizers are more of a salt base for solubility. Unfortunately, it kills or is a detriment to the soil's ecology.
That's what I was trying to get at. Thank you.
Cool. If you have crops that are left over or returning from last year, like arugula and spinach, are we better off replacing them or letting them grow to harvest?
If you have things still growing right now, then harvest them. What's going to happen, is as it gets a little bit warmer, they're going to start to go to seed. You know, particularly things that are biennial. But yeah, you know, if you have lettuce, still, like I still have lettuce and spinach going in my garden, harvest that stuff, particularly before it starts to get a little bit warmer. Once we get into like, well, who knows, but probably May-ish, they're gonna start to bolt. They're gonna start to send up seed heads May, you know, and then into June as the days get a little bit longer.
Related to that, someone asked about collards and kale from the fall that are still green and aren't limp. Should I try to continue growing them or pull them up? And it's same answer, right? Like, go ahead and eat them. And even when they do go to seed, collards in particular have produced these like brilliantly yellow flowers like we had in Sister last year.
Yeah.
And they're actually pretty delicious.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can, if you get them before they bloom, it's kind of like broccoli.
Yeah. Do you have any advice on good ways to protect crops from squirrels and rabbits? I think the questions about squirrels have been really coming up a lot this year.
Yeah, squirrels are hard. Dogs. You know, people talk about flash tape or like, you know, the idea of something that stirs in the wind, because, you know, squirrels are prone to be skittish. There's also like, you know, some fancy stuff out there, like, you know, laser triggered water, garden sprayers. So like once they go, if they walk by in front of the garden sprayer, then it goes, you know, goes off and starts spraying them and scares them. You know, there's no one way that works great. You know, I know some people that actually trap them and will take them to another park or another part of the city. So there's not a great answer for squirrels, unfortunately.
Yeah. I wonder too if it's like, are they worse or are people just, because you know, we're spending more time at home, or are people just more aware of?
I don't know. It's been, they're a pain, and it, you know, it also depends on what's going on in the garden and what's going on in the environment, like in the particular time of year. Like if it's a really dry summer, they'll go after the tomatoes because they're looking for water. But if it wasn't a really dry summer, then maybe they wouldn't particularly. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's some more creative. I'm sure there's some more creative ideas out there. Not more are coming to mind currently.
Kind of a combination of chicken wire and hoop house.
Oh
if,
yeah, sure.
If you can
Sure.
take a piece
Yeah.
of rebar, put it in the ground, use that as your stake.
Yeah.
Take it's the irrigation plastic PVC.
Yeah.
Bend it over into your hoop format and use your chicken wire.
Right.
On the top.
Yeah. Sure.
And then in the
Great.
fall, you can use that as your extended grow season house.
Yeah, I mean, you probably might want to take the chicken wire off, but yes. Yeah.
No, we took the plastic tubing for the water. We used that as the frame.
Right.
And then we had taken the insulation for like pipes, for preventing pipes from freezing.
The black stuff, the foam stuff.
Yes. And we put that right on top of that to prevent the wire from poking through the bisqueen for extended grow season.
Cool.
And the squirrels didn't go through, but the next spring you got to take that bisqueen off or even remove the entire hoop house so you can redo your soil.
Right on. Yep. Thanks, Oliver.
And then related to that, where would one get supplies to to do all these things that deter squirrels?
Most of the things that Oliver was talking, I mean, everything that Oliver was talking about would be available at the hardware store. I will note that another option for the hoops is using metal conduit,
Yep.
like 1/2-inch metal conduit, EMT it's called. You can, it's usually in the electrical department at the hardware store. We have a bender to do 4-foot wide bends or 6-foot wide bends for Garden Resource Program members. And it would be a matter of, contacting me. I will put, well, if you wouldn't mind putting my email in the chat. And we can schedule a time to bend those for you. And then I would say for the plastic covering, if you go that route, that I would advise on trying to get either using row cover, which is kind of a special thing, or using like particularly greenhouse plastic, which you can get in 10-foot widths, and you can get it on a small scale, and it's relatively inexpensive. It's for for example, for a 15-foot length, it's probably under $10 or $10 to $15. Because the clear plastic that you would get from the hardware store tends to photo degrade or break down in the sun relatively quickly over 6 months, and it'll become brittle, and it's a big mess over time. But the chicken wire you can get at the hardware, at most hardware stores.
If you're on the east side of Detroit right now, DTE is redoing the infrastructure for gas. They are cutting off those plastic PVC lines in 12 to 16-foot lengths. It's their scrap. They're just giving it away. So
Cool.
if you don't have a lot of money, they'll just give it to you.
Where at?
On the east side of Detroit.
Where in particular?
Right now it's East English Village, but they are moving from East Point south.
Okay.
They're slowly going.
That gives a general idea of that. Okay. Far east heading toward downtown.
Yes.
Okay.
So that's free.
Awesome.
Does KGG have a graphic document that shows crop rotation and that goes into it in depth? And one that also includes information about plant families?
Not currently. I would say a good book to check out that might be useful would be The New Organic Grower by Elliot Coleman. That's one that comes to mind that talks about rotation.
What is that name again?
The New Organic Grower, Elliot Coleman.
New Organic Grower.
Put it in the chat. Maybe that's something that we can add to our long list of quick.
Yeah, we're working on plans to do more kind of one-page reference guide, so it's a good idea to add to our list.
Can seeds be forced to see if they will germinate?
Yes. It's a great concept. So basically, you can take a piece of paper towel and a Ziploc bag, and depending on how many seeds you have, you would count out, 10 if you only have a few, or 100 if you have a lot of them, and then put them, and then basically wet the paper towel, put the seeds on top of it, fold the paper towel on top of the seeds, put it into the Ziploc bag, and seal it up, and then put you want to usually put it in a warm spot. So the, ideal temperature for them to germinate. That varies from variety to variety, but somewhere in the range of, 60 to 70 degrees. And then either by referencing what the days to germination are, to know when to check on them, or just check on them every day or two and take a look. And then you'll see how many of those germinated, and then you can kind of extrapolate what the germination percentage is that will help you, proceed with your planting.
Regarding perennials, can you plant something where it is once? Sorry, can you plant something where it is once it stops producing for the season? Do you just leave it where it is year after year?
Perennial fruit is something that you want to give a permanent home. I mean, you could, I wouldn't even really advise planting most things in pots. I just don't think that they perform as well when they don't have, access to the nutrients and the water. Pots tend to dry out relatively quickly or frequently, and it's hard to stay on top of them. So I would say if you're planting a perennial, that's its home. That space isn't going to change or until you decide you don't want that perennial anymore.
I was talking about something like asparagus. So you would plant that, like, could I plant it in a raised garden bed and then it would just stay in the same bed year over year?
Yeah, that's the risk, or asparagus is amazing, right? We love asparagus, but essentially, that's going to be occupying that space. So you're losing that real estate.
And then you can't plant something like, once you've picked all the asparagus, you can't plant something kind of where it is.
No.
You'll disturb it. Okay.
And also to note that when you're harvesting asparagus, you don't want to harvest all of it. You want to harvest.
Yeah, you just break it off, right?
Well, so asparagus is the young, what we eat is the young fronds of a fern-like plant, if you're not
okay
familiar. Which gets to 3 or 4 feet tall. It gets up into this nice airy,
I guess I didn't know that. Cool.
Yeah. So another consideration in that situation is, one, that you don't want to harvest all of the fronds or all of the asparagus, because it needs to grow up into a mature plant to store energy to create more asparagus for you next year. And two, that's a tall plant, so plant accordingly in terms of sunlight and shading out other plants in that bed.
Cool. Any tips when we're planting our garden for what should go where when you're considering light management?
So I didn't go into this, but you should have a general sense of the orientation of the light. Sun rises in the east, sets in the west. How does that go across your garden? And you need to know about that particularly during the growing season, because the sun is lower in the sky at this time of year, and it'll become, it changes over the year. But once you have kind of an evaluation of like, okay, I know that this spot gets full sun, you want to like particularly pay attention. I'm thinking about my own garden. So, the way that the sun goes over my house, it goes over the front of my house and it sets at the back of my house, essentially. So I know that, most of my garden is getting prime sun by 10, 11 o'clock into the evening. But if I planted things at the back, tall things at the back of my garden, the sun would be casting shade on the things towards the front of my house, if that makes sense. So it's a scenario where I usually try and plant taller things, towards closer to my house, not the back of my garden, to prevent shading in the late day sun. You need to do kind of an evaluation of how sunlight moves through your garden, and consider, for low growing things, it's kind of a non problem, as long as you know that you have 8 to 10 hours of sunlight hitting your garden. For lettuce and anything that kind of grows close to the ground, there's really not going to be too much competition. And that's reasonable, as long as you're dealing with spacing properly. But if they're, you got to work out the scenarios to think about shading and where does it hit the garden? You might be in the opposite. Maybe all your prime sun is first thing in the morning at dawn till midday, and then you get shading, and it's a different animal.
On the reference guide, why do some crops show 2 different days to harvest? For example, arugula shows 21.
Yeah. Good question. That is baby leaf versus more mature leaves. So like 21 is like when you can first start to harvest that arugula, but if you want slightly larger arugula, then that's the other number.
Cool. What are some crops that do well in containers to save space in the beds in small gardens?
What do you like to eat? I mean, generally speaking, it's a hard question to answer. Fruiting crops take up more, like, generally speaking, if it's a fruiting crop, if it's an eggplant, if it's a pepper, if it's a tomato, particularly if it's a squash or a watermelon, those take up lots of space. But they're also all awesome and delicious, and who doesn't want to have those in your garden? So maybe do less of those. But things that take up, I mean, I wonder if the question is more, or like I might say, what gives the most yield per area that's delicious? Is the person that asked that question, can you speak up and like maybe talk more about what you're looking for?
Hey, yeah, so I asked that question, and so I guess I was more thinking like things that I was thinking of taking my herbs and putting them in containers just to kind of save space in the
That's a
raised
great
beds,
idea.
because we just don't have a lot of space. So I guess my question was more like what things might do a little bit better in containers to have more luck, if that makes sense.
In containers. In
Yeah,
particular.
like,
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought it was talking about raised beds, but which is slightly different.
Yeah.
So when you have limited root space, when you're growing containers can do really well. There's just a couple management things that like are a little bit finicky. So you definitely have to water them more because they just tend to dry out relatively quickly. And so, whereas if you had the comparison between an in-ground bed and a container, you're going to be watering the container, every couple of days at least. Things that tend to do, in my experience, things that tend to perform the best are shallow rooted things like the leafy greens, arugula, spinach, lettuce, mustards, any of those like, leafy salad like things that are harvested small. Herbs do terrific. And the consideration for containers on some of the larger things, or you know, is to really take the spacing literally. So like, if ultimately you want to grow beans and the bean space, beans are going to be, 10 to 12 inches apart. If you only have a pot that's 10 to 12 inches in diameter, that's one bean plant. That's it. Because that you just have to think about the way that the real estate shakes out. It just seems like otherwise you're just having a lot of competition. You can maybe play games with that, with like trying to do like liquid organic fertilizers and stuff, and that'll help you out to like give those, help. But most of the, most vegetables have the root systems that are kind of, the general understanding is that the root system of a plant kind of extends to its canopy. But there's all these other little root hairs and things that extend beyond that. And when you're actually in the ground, that help the plant manage. So, but the short answer is shallow rooted things.
So someone who is a first time gardener is wondering if they need to order topsoil, compost, and worms to go into their soil.
For a raised bed, or for just a in-ground garden bed?
Great.
Well, I'll just answer it.
Just for a garden, just for the to lay out on the ground. I'm gonna put some cardboard down to keep the weeds from coming through, and then I want to order some topsoil and have it dumped. But I looked online at Home Depot, and it came with topsoil, compost, and some worms or something. And I was wondering if I really needed that or not.
So this is just grass right now.
Yes.
Okay. So what you're basically explaining is doing a lasagna bed, which is where you kill the grass, you put some cardboard down, you put compost and soil on top of that, and as the cardboard smothers the grass, and it encourages all the microbial activity, and the worms work its way up and down through that, and ultimately you get some nice soil to work with, which is a concept that works, but it's going to take some time.
Okay.
The other alternative is like, who knows? How do you know? Maybe your soil is good. Maybe your soil is reasonable. I mean, it depends on, of course, there's the factors of labor, like, do you have somebody to help you till it up, or at least remove the sod so you can turn the soil over. But one way to know for sure what you're dealing with is to do a soil test. And
how do I do that?
The basic concept, you as a garden resource program member, we do one free soil test for gardens. And if you need to do additional, it's $30 a test. The concept is basically, no bigger than a 30 by 30 area, depending on how big the garden you plan to grow in. But you're laying out where the garden's going to be. You're going to dig up, a patch of soil. So I usually, put the shovel directly in the ground, lift it up, back it up an inch, go down. So you get a nice cake slice of the soil, take off the grass or whatever's at the top, throw that in a 5-gallon bucket, do that a dozen more times randomly throughout where the vegetable garden is going to grow.
Okay.
Mix that up really well. Take 2 cups, dry it out, put it in a Ziploc bag, bring it into us, and then we'll see.
Okay. I can do that tomorrow.
Yeah, and it's I mean, and I know I went through it quick. We have directions on our website, or if you need more help with that, you can call us.
Okay.
Yeah, here I'm going to throw the link to our soil testing guide into the chat so you can check it out.
Thank you.
You are welcome. Thanks for asking.
Okay, well, we are right at 8 o'clock.
I have a couple more questions.
That's fine. Well, let me just say that, if you are inclined to take off, because we said we were going to end at 8, no you won't hurt our feelings. We want to respect people's time. I'm happy to stick around and answer questions, to continue answering questions.
Cool. So what are some good plants also side note, I feel like last year we did a farmer Q&A, and I think we should do another one, maybe try to squeeze another one in this year. Yeah. Are there some good plants to plant now that will encourage pollinators?
Stay tuned for our Keep Growing Detroit has been growing native plants for a handful of years, and we do a native plant sale. I don't know the timeline for it yet this year, but it will be coming. It's coming up this spring and summer. I would encourage you to look towards some of that stuff. Not that there are many sources out in the world. Right now, not necessarily. I mean, generally speaking, a few varieties are yarrows, and I mean, when you're planting your garden, things like dill, and the flowers from the dill, and oh boy, I don't have a bunch on the top of my head. If you are really interested in that, drop me an email, and I have a great resource, and I can share it with you. On particularly on perennials that are great for pollinators.
Okay, just put your email back in the chat again. And where can we find information about how long each particular seed type should be sowed indoors before transplanting to the garden? Basically, when to start sprouting each plant type. Okay.
In terms of the seeds that we distribute for the Garden Resource Program, all of those things that we distribute can be started directly in the ground, and there are instructions of when to do that. But some of them can also be started indoors, and it depends. I think the easiest way to get that information without going down an exhaustive list would be to get a Johnny Seed catalog or go to the Johnny Seeds website. And there is in each section of the catalog with the different types of vegetables, there's a cultural information box. It's also on their website. Just look for growing information, and that'll tell you, usually in relation to the first frost date. I'm sorry, last frost date. When to plant that stuff indoors. I mean, once the summer hits, or once it starts to get warmer, you can be starting things whenever you feel like it, and then kind of get them to size. And as long as they have, the only thing that you need to think about is, does this have enough? What is this days to maturity? And do I have enough time for that to grow to its maturity before the frost?
Cool. I think those are all of our questions.
Okay. Does anybody else want to shout anything out before we take off for the night?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
If you're not a part of the Garden Resource Program, where would you recommend getting good soil for raised beds?
Where are you at?
Say that again.
Where do you live?
Southwest.
Man, you should join the Garden Resource Program. It's the best deal in town. But Southwest Detroit. I would say that what to get would be to get 50-50, which is 50% topsoil, 50% compost. I would not recommend getting bags from Home Depot or places like that, because you're buying bag after bag, and it's going to add up quick. But it depends on the size of the beds that you're working with. You know,
Mhm.
it may, now that I think about it, that may be a slightly better way to go if you only had one raised bed to fill, you know, because to get it, well, all right, start over. If you want to get a yard of compost 50-50 mix from a place called like Maine's, there's Eagle. A lot of these are like just outside the city. I don't know any of, I would think down like Southwest, there's got to be some place like downriver. I just haven't looked for resources down that way.
Mhm.
We do have a resource sheet that we can share. If you want to drop me an email, I can like, you know, share the information from that. But it's just a consideration that like if they're going to deliver, so it's going to be probably $25 to $35 for a yard, and then probably another $25 or $30 for delivery. So you're better off if you have a pickup truck and you can go to one of these places and they can put it, you know, dump it into your pickup truck. Or if you're getting volume, like if you're filling 5-10 raised beds, then, you know, maybe it's worth paying for delivery.
Mhm.
That's
I-
helpful.
okay.
Thank you.
I have a
Uh-huh.
question.
Yeah.
If I'm in the garden club, how
Uh-huh.
much topsoil am I allowed to get for my garden?
So we don't distribute topsoil. We do distribute compost.
Okay.
And that's something that we'll have resource centers around the city. You'll get notification. We're still rolling all that stuff out.
Okay.
Information is forthcoming.
Okay.
For a family garden, I believe it's a half yard,
Mm-hmm.
which is something in the nature of like 6 to 8 buckets.
Okay. So this is a community garden that I'm doing a
So
project through.
right. So a community garden, I'm sorry, I made an assumption there. For a community garden, I believe it's a yard.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's still a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to get a yard, and then the rest of it I get from it says I'm gonna need about, how much did he say? I'm gonna need a lot. Looks like because my space is 30 by 25 square feet.
Are you growing in ground?
Yes, it's gonna be in the ground.
Okay. Well, it sounds like somebody's helping you figure that out. Well, I would tell you that if you want it, there is a calculator that can help you figure out how much compost you would want ultimately to have.
Okay.
So I would just Google compost calculator.
Okay.
Usually it's some business, but you just type in the area, how many square feet that you want, and then how deep you want it to be, and then it'll tell you how many yards you need.
Okay, Oliver Washington, who was just on here, said depth should be 6 inches, length 25 wide by 30 feet, equal 14 cubic yards or 375 cubic feet.
I mean, 6 inches of compost is, you know, it's going to treat you right, but you don't necessarily, I don't know the whole scope of your project, so I won't, I'm just saying you may not need
this
that
is my
much,
first time. Okay.
But if you're working with something, you'll have a banging garden with 6 inches of compost, I'll tell you that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my budget is not really big because I'm in the LEAP program, the sustainability program, and this is my project. So so the bulk of my funds from my project is going for the topsoil and the compost.
Okay. Yeah. Again, I guess, we do offer consultation on these kinds of things outside of classes like this.
And maybe I can get if you have topsoil available, maybe I can get it from the program and pay for it versus giving the money to
we
Home Depot.
don't carry topsoil. But
Okay, so I can, if you have compost over the, once I get the amount that I'm allotted, then if I could purchase the rest from you, I'd rather purchase it from you than purchase it from Home Depot and put the money back into the program.
yeah, right on. Well, it doesn't quite work like that with us, but we could definitely help give you some guidance to get you what you're looking for.
That's good. Thank you.
Yeah, and feel free to drop me an email if it would be either me or I could help get you in contact with the right person.
Okay, I'm gonna send you an
down the
email.
line.
Okay, thanks.
Right on.
We're excited for your garden, Mary.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm
Um,
excited.
One more
Okay.
question about for GRP members, if they want to drop off their GRP application, if they want to print it out, fill it out, and bring it to the office, is there a mailbox that they can drop it in? Or is it best for us to receive it, for someone to be at the office to receive it?
GRP apps can go in our mailbox. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
We have, it's a secure mailbox.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Cool. And someone had a question about purchasing compost, but they can shoot you an email, right? For
Yes.
okay, great.
I have one more quick question. For the garden resource program, is it per lot or is it like per organization or family?
It is per garden, per, so are you a family garden or a community garden?
No, so there's a community garden, but we have two different lots. And so we already technically are part of the resource program for one of the lots. But we are wanting to do more on a different lot. And so I don't know if we need to reapply or if it's only because we have it for the one lot, if it's too late.
Well, I think that kind of depends on what you think you need. I mean, ultimately, like when you join as a garden resource program member for a community garden, you get, on that, you can look at the resource sheet to have a general sense of how much you're getting, but you get a substantial amount of plants. So maybe that's enough for both those lots.
Okay.
I mean, a garden. So if it's one organization kind of operating or one kind of group of people operating over two spaces that's functioning, like in theory, if they were lots next to each other, that would just be one big garden.
Right.
I might just do that under one garden name, but if you feel like you need more resources, you can join for another space. But just with the understanding that like there is a limited amount of stuff and we have a lot of people in the program. So we're
Right.
just, just trying to think about what you actually need.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Cool. I think that's all the questions in the chat.
Okay, terrific. Good to have you guys out. Thanks for being my wing lady, Lola. Appreciate you.
Got you.
Okay. Good night, all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.